The morning sun in Podgornoy was a foreman with no sense of humor. It arrived early, sharp, and demanding. It sliced through the kitchen window of their fifth-floor apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the sink and falling squarely on a single, unwashed glass. Sergei stood before it, his large, calloused hands braced on the edge of the counter. The tea inside had evaporated, leaving a dark, stubborn tide mark and a sediment of leaves at the bottom. It wasn't his glass. He knew this with a bone-deep certainty that required no proof, the same way he knew a spirit level was off by a hair just by the heft of it in his hand. His world was built on tangibles. On the gritty bite of sand and cement, the clean weight of a brick, the unwavering line of a chalk string. His language was measurement and resistance. Things stood or fell based on immutable laws. But this was a disturbance in the air. A flaw in the atmosphere of his own home. It hadn't been one thing. It was a series of subtle, almost polite intrusions. A new scent in her car last week, something musky and expensive, clinging to the upholstery beneath the familiar notes of her pear-scented air freshener. I gave a ride to a colleague from accounting. He smokes those dreadful cigars, she'd said, waving a hand as if shooing a fly. Then, the lipstick. A shade of crimson she'd never worn before, too bold for the office. It was on sale. Do you like it? He grunted, his eyes on the sports news, but the color had burned itself into his peripheral vision. And now, this glass. He had his rituals. His mug, chipped on the handle, lived on the left side of the drying rack. Irina's delicate teacup belonged on the right. This glass sat dead center, an insolent usurper. And the lip print, or rather, the lack of it. Sergei drank his tea like a man putting out a fire, slurping, leaving a distinct, concave dent on the rim. This rim was pristine, smooth, kissed by careful, unfamiliar lips. A coldness settled in his gut, dense and heavy as poured concrete. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was the disorienting vertigo of a master builder who has just heard, for the first time, the soft, almost musical sigh of a foundational crack in what he believed was solid ground. The house was still standing. Breakfast smells, toast, cheap coffee still filled the air. Their daughter Alyanka's sleepy voice carried from her room. But Sergei, staring at the condemned glass, knew something had already shifted. The physics of his life were no longer sound. Sergei did not storm. He did not shout or demand explanations. Confrontation was a blunt instrument, good for swinging at visible problems, a drunken fool on a site, a delinquent supplier. This was different. This required the meticulous, patient work of a surveyor mapping unstable terrain. He began to build his case. Not with emotion, but with observation. Brick by brick, fact by fact, he would construct the truth until it was as undeniable as a load-bearing wall. He started with a calendar in his mind. Wednesday, Irina's short day at the factory office. She texted, running late, paperwork avalanche. Don't wait with dinner. He'd eaten alone, watching the news, the empty chair across from him feeling heavier than usual. When she'd finally come in, her cheeks were flushed, and she'd talked too fast about a new reporting system. The energy around her was electric, jangling, not the tired slump of overtime. Then, the phone. It had become an appendage, but now it was a secretive one. She no longer left it charging on the hallway table where the family charger was. It migrated with her, screen perpetually facing down, a black, polished slate hiding its secrets. On Saturday, while he was pouring a foundation slab on the new municipal building, his own phone had shown 2 missed calls from her. When he'd called back, she'd sounded breathless. "Oh, I tried to call. The signal out there must be terrible. I just wanted to know if you'd be home for lunch." A trivial thing. But Sergei dealt in trivialities. The precise amount of water in a mix, the exact spacing of rebar. 2 calls, minutes apart, suggested insistence, not a failed attempt. He identified the source almost by accident. Driving home past the factory one evening, he'd seen a sleek, silver foreign car pulling out of the executive lot. Behind the wheel was a man in a collared shirt, no tie, hair cut in the sharp, expensive style only one salon in town offered. A face from the factory's newsletter photo he glimpsed on the kitchen table, Nikolai Petrovich, new head of accounting. The man who drove a car worth 3 years of Sergei's salary and whose cologne, Sergei now realized with a cold click of recognition, was the same musky, intrusive scent that had haunted their own Ziguli. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was structural. Each piece locked into the next, her altered schedule syncing with his presence, the guarded phone, the foreign smell now attached to a name and a face. Sergei didn't feel the hot spike of betrayal yet. He felt a grim, professional clarity. The blueprint of their daily life had been altered without his consent. A new element had been introduced, and it was putting stress on the entire design. He was no longer a husband sensing disloyalty. He was a foreman assessing a build that was dangerously off-spec. The theoretical became tangible on a Thursday afternoon. Sergei's crew had been sent home early when a shipment of tiles failed to arrive. Instead of heading to the garage for a beer with the boys, he found his feet carrying him toward the city park, a place of manicured paths and artificial ponds he normally had no use for. He told himself he was just walking, clearing the dust of the site from his lungs. But his path was unerring, a line drawn toward the secluded benches near the old bandstand. And there they were. They weren't touching. There was no dramatic, cinematic embrace. They sat a careful, respectable foot apart on a green wooden bench. Nikolai Petrovich was speaking, gesturing with one hand, a confident, easy smile on his face. And Irina. Irina was laughing. It was the laugh that drove the invisible surveyor's stake straight through Sergei's chest. It was her old laugh. The one he hadn't heard in years, not the tired, abbreviated chuckle she offered at his jokes, or the affectionate sigh she gave Alyonka's antics. This was the full, unguarded, melodic sound from when they were young, when his jokes were new and her delight was a prize he'd just won. It spilled from her, bright and careless, and she was tilting her head toward the other man in a way that was both familiar and utterly foreign. He stood frozen, half hidden by the thick trunk of an oak, the rough bark pressing into his shoulder. He watched as Nikolai said something else, and Irina shook her head, still smiling, a gesture of playful denial. The space between them on the bench seemed to vibrate with a silent, potent energy. It wasn't the quiet of his kitchen, comfortable and worn. It was the tense, humming quiet of a wire pulled taut. The visual proof, so stark and simple, did not bring anger. It brought a suffocating weight, as if the foundation slab he'd poured that morning had settled directly onto his lungs. He couldn't breathe. The sounds of the park, children shouting, a distant radio, faded into a muffled roar. He turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the gravel path. He didn't go home. He descended into the cool, oil-scented dimness of the underground garage, to the space where his own boxy, reliable Lada sat. He didn't start the engine. He just sat in the driver's seat, in the dark, his hands resting on the steering wheel that was worn smooth in places his palms knew by heart. His thoughts were not of the man in the park, not of violence or revenge. They were of the fragile ecosystem inside his apartment. Of Alyonka, who was probably upstairs right now, bent over her homework at the kitchen table, humming some pop song. Of the previous Sunday, when they'd all watched a silly movie, and Irina, exhausted from a week of work and, whatever this was, had leaned her head against his shoulder and fallen asleep halfway through. Her weight had been a comfort. Had that comfort been a lie? Or in that unguarded moment of sleep, had she, like him, forgotten about the crack splitting their world in two? The question was a fresh ache, more piercing than the initial shock. He sat there until the single bare bulb lighting the garage flickered on with an automatic click, announcing the evening. Only then did he climb the stairs, each step feeling like he was hauling a sack of cement up to the 5th floor. The inevitable collision occurred not with a planned detonation, but with the quiet, seismic shift of two tectonic plates that could no longer avoid each other. It was a Friday. Irina had a corporate event. She'd said it with a breezy wave that morning, avoiding his eyes as she adjusted her earring, the new, dangly ones he'd never seen before. Sergei put Alyonka to bed, read her a story with a voice he hoped sounded normal, and then sat in the darkened living room. He didn't turn on the TV. He just sat, waiting in the silent apartment, a sentinel at the gate of a kingdom already breached. He heard her key in the lock just after midnight. The soft click, the sigh of the door, the careful, slightly unsteady sound of her heels being kicked off in the hall. She moved through the darkness toward the bedroom, a shadow among shadows. "I made tea." His voice cut through the quiet, flat, and devoid of inflection. "It's cold now." She gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath. He saw her silhouette freeze in the doorway. "Suresh, you're still up?" "Yes," he said. I waited. The two sentences hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. He didn't need to see her face to feel her panic, the frantic recalculation. The familiar, cloying scent of her perfume was there, but beneath it, woven through like a dark thread in a cheap fabric, was the other smell. The musky, expensive one. It filled the space between them, the final piece of evidence presented not in a courtroom, but in their own home. He didn't move. He didn't turn on the light. He simply asked the question he had been building in his mind for weeks, brick by painful brick. He stripped it of rage, of tears, of theatrical pain. He delivered it with the grim finality of a structural assessment. With whom? Not, "Are you having an affair?" Not, "How could you?" Just the simple, devastating demand for the name of the variable that had shattered his equation. The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of a dam breaking under a pressure it was never meant to hold. He heard her breath hitch, then the wet, ragged sound of a sob she couldn't contain. She didn't try to lie. Perhaps his tone, so terrifyingly calm and certain, made denial seem not just pointless, but absurd. "Sergei, I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out in a choked whisper, followed by a flood of others. They were the expected, pathetic currency of betrayal. "You're always at work." "We don't talk anymore." I felt invisible. He listens. He sees me. He listened to the familiar script, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow weariness. They were just words like load-bearing or stress tolerance, but empty of the meaning that gave his own vocabulary power. They explained nothing. They were the cheap plaster trying to fill a canyon. When her words finally sputtered into quiet weeping, he spoke again. His voice was still calm, but it held the finality of a verdict, of a sight being condemned. "Okay." A single word, absorbing her confession, her excuses, her tears, and rendering them inert. "Go to sleep." He paused, thinking of the innocent life in the next room, the only thing in this wreckage that still mattered. "Don't wake Aliona." He didn't hear her move. After a long moment, he heard the soft shuffle of her feet retreating down the hall, the click of the bedroom door closing, not quite shutting. He remained in his chair, in the dark, staring at nothing. The confrontation was over. There had been no fight, no shattered dishes, no dramatic exit. Just a diagnosis delivered and accepted. The house was still standing, but everyone inside now knew it was built on a fault line. Morning did not bring clarity. It brought a new, fragile routine. The apartment, once a habitat, became a shared construction site where two people moved with the careful, silent precision of workers avoiding a known weak spot in the floor. Sergei did not move out. He simply redistributed the space. That evening, he pulled the old, creaking fold-out cot from the storage balcony and set it up in the living room. He made the bed with military neatness, the gray wool blanket pulled taut. It was not an act of spite, but of engineering. A necessary partition. Irina, hovering in the kitchen doorway, watched him with red-rimmed eyes, her mouth opening and closing on words that never came. She finally whispered, "You don't have to," but he cut her off with a shake of his head, a foreman dismissing an irrelevant suggestion. They became polite cohabitants. Their conversations were stripped of everything but the functional, as if speaking a pidgin language of survival. The water bill came. "I'll pick up Aliona after her piano lesson on Thursday." The tap in the bathroom is dripping again. They orbited each other, giving wide berth, their movements timed to avoid collision in the narrow kitchen. The silence was not peaceful, but pressurized, like the air before a storm that never breaks. Irina tried to rebuild. Her attempts were visible, painful in their transparency. She began cooking his favorite solyanka, the rich, sour soup that took hours to prepare. She bought his preferred brand of beer and left it in the fridge, even though he rarely drank at home. She would initiate conversation about his work, her voice straining with a forced, bright interest that rang more hollow than silence. Sergei observed these efforts with the detached eye of an inspector. Her care felt like a fresh coat of paint slathered over damp, crumbling plaster. It was a cosmetic fix, a temporary measure that did nothing to address the saturated wall behind it. He would eat the soup, nod at her questions, thank her for the beer. But each gesture from her only widened the crack. Her affection had become a performance, and he could no longer see the actor behind the role. Lying on the thin cot at night, listening to the familiar groan of the refrigerator, his thoughts sometimes turned to Nikolai Petrovich. Not with the boiling rage of a cuckold, but with a cold, almost professional contempt. He imagined the man in his silver car, with his accountant's calculations and his expensive cologne, believing he had won something. He had stolen materials from another man's site. He had built his little fantasy on a foundation of deception and stolen time. Sergei, who had spent his life erecting structures meant to last, knew one thing with absolute certainty. Anything built on a rotten, stolen base was condemned from the start. It was not a victory. It was a violation of the first rule of construction, and it would inevitably fail. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a grim sense of witnessing a profound, amateurish error. The truest understanding came not in a moment of high drama, but in a mundane flash of domestic twilight. Sergei was washing the dishes after a silent dinner. Irina was drying, her movements slow and deliberate. Their hands did not touch in the soapy water. Her gaze was fixed on the plate she was polishing, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. He watched her scrub at a dried speck of food, her knuckles white with a tense, unnecessary force. He saw the new fine lines at the corners of her eyes, etched not just by time, but by the strain of holding two lives in parallel. In that moment, the last of the confusion burned away, leaving behind a cold, mineral clarity. He realized he could have weathered a storm. A single, catastrophic lapse. A moment of weakness in the face of loneliness or flattery, born of a human hunger he might, in time, have learned to comprehend. He could have maybe, even understood a desperate, passionate affair, a fire that burned too hot and too fast, leaving only ash and regret. That would have been a crack, a repair job, a painful but finite project, but this was not that. What she had done was colder, more methodical. It was architectural sabotage. She had lived inside the structure of their life for years. She knew the weight of every shared memory, the tensile strength of their routines, the quiet load-bearing joy of their daughter's existence. She knew where every supporting beam was placed. And with that intimate knowledge, she had deliberately, quietly removed one. Not in a blind rage, but with the careful calculation of someone who thinks they can remodel without the foundation crumbling. She hadn't done it to build something new with him, this Nikolai. She had done it simply because she could. Because she wanted to feel the thrill of dismantling, of having a secret, of being seen by new eyes. She had traded the integrity of their home for a cheap, transient feeling. That was the unforgivable fault line. Not the sex, not the lies to his face, but the profound betrayal of their shared craft, the craft of building a life. She had used the blueprint of their marriage to plot its weakening. The crack was no longer just in their relationship. It was in him. A fundamental stratum of his being, the one that believed in solidity, in the inherent trustworthiness of things built with care, had been sheared clean through. Where there had once been the bedrock of certainty, now there was a void, thinly bridged by the daily grit of routine, work, meals, Alyonka's homework. Lying on his cot later, staring at the dark ceiling, he understood the final, simple truth. This thin crust of normalcy was temporary. It was like a layer of asphalt poured over a sinkhole. It would hold for a while, under the light traffic of everyday errands and polite exchanges. But it couldn't bear any real weight, not a serious illness, not a financial blow, not the simple, accumulating pressure of years. Eventually, it would give way. And Sergei, a man who could calculate the stress tolerance of steel and concrete to the kilogram, found himself facing a terrifying equation with no solution. He was the master of reliable structures, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no blueprint for what came after the collapse.